Welcome to Dark Domain, where shadows stretch and the unknown lurks just beyond the light. Tonight we've unearthed 3 chilling tales that will crawl under your skin and stay with you long after the lights go out. These aren't just stories, they're disturbing accounts that blur the line between reality and nightmare. But before we start, if you could send one message to your past self, what would it be? Drop it in the comments, and let's see what advice or warning you'd send through time. If you find yourself constantly checking the corners of your room after watching, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay connected with more unsettling stories. Oh, and leave a like, because we know you won't sleep tonight anyway. The cold below. I never thought I'd return to Alaska. After spending my childhood up here, I swore I'd never go back. I always preferred cities with busy streets, fast cars, and crowds of people. But when the offer came in to do some maintenance work on an old research station in the wilderness outside Anchorage, I couldn't say no. The pay was good. And besides, a few days away from the chaos of Seattle didn't seem like such a bad idea. The station, as it turns out, wasn't just any research post. It had been built back in the 80s for geological studies, monitoring seismic activity and drilling deep into the ice. The funding dried up, and the place was abandoned, left to freeze under layers of snow and forgotten. My job was simple: assess the building, make any repairs necessary, and ensure the station was in working order for a new research team that was planning to move in. Simple, right? The helicopter dropped me off just outside the station. The pilot, a guy named Rick, didn't stick around long. As soon as I stepped out, he gave me a quick nod and took off. I watched as the helicopter disappeared into the gray sky, leaving me alone in the middle of nowhere. The cold hit me immediately. Even though I'd grown up in Alaska, I had forgotten how biting the cold could be, how it seeps into your bones and makes your breath hang in the air like a ghost. I pulled my jacket tighter and trudged through the snow toward the station. It was just as I expected, run down and covered in frost. The building had a couple of large windows, most of them cracked, and a rusting satellite dish perched on top. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the stale air hit me, a mixture of old machinery, must, and the faint smell of something metallic. Inside, the station was cramped but functional. The main room housed several workstations, a lab area, and a small living space where the researchers had once bunked. There was a storage room off to the side, filled with old equipment and drilling gear. I flicked on the lights, and after a few sputters, the fluorescent bulbs flickered to life. The power was still running, thank God for that. But I knew it wouldn't last long. My first task was to check the generator in the basement. The basement was a cold, damp room that smelled like rusted metal and something else I couldn't place. As I descended the stairs, I noticed how the walls were slick with condensation, even though the temperature outside was well below freezing. I made a mental note to check the ventilation system after I dealt with the generator. The generator itself was in decent shape, though it had a few signs of wear. I tinkered with it for a bit, replacing some parts and ensuring it was functioning properly. As I worked, I felt an odd sensation, like I was being watched. I glanced around the dim basement, but there was nothing but shadows and old equipment. Shaking off the feeling, I finished up and headed back upstairs. I had more work to do, patching up some cracks, checking the water supply, testing the communication system. It was during this last task that things started to get weird. The comm system was ancient, but it still worked. I was running a test, sending signals to check for any interference when I picked up something strange. It wasn't just static or garbled radio noise. It was a voice. At first, it was faint, barely audible. I adjusted the frequency, trying to get a clearer signal. And there it was again, muffled but unmistakable. A man's voice. Help. Trapped. I froze, listening intently. Underground. Can't. Cold. I immediately grabbed the headset, trying to respond. Hello? Who's there? Where are you? There was silence, just static. I tried again. Can you hear me? Where are you? Nothing. I stared at the radio in disbelief. Was someone else out here? Was this a distress call? I checked the system again, trying to figure out where the signal was coming from, but I couldn't pinpoint it. The signal had vanished. I told myself it was just an old recording, maybe some interference from another station. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The voice had sounded too real, too desperate. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that voice in my head, repeating over and over again. Trapped, underground, cold. Around midnight, I gave up on trying to rest and decided to go through some of the old files stored in the lab. Most of it was geological data, records of the drilling projects and weather patterns. But then I found something strange, an old notebook hidden behind a stack of dusty papers. The notebook belonged to one of the original researchers, a man named Dr. Alistair Clark. From the looks of it, he'd been one of the last people at the station before it shut down. As I flipped through the pages, I found entries describing their work, nothing unusual at first, just notes about the drilling progress and the samples they'd been collecting. But the last few entries, those were different. August 14th, 1987. We've hit something unusual in the ice core samples. The deeper we go, the more the temperature anomalies increase. It's impossible. Should be getting colder, but it's not. There's something down there. I can't explain it. August 16th, 1987. We've uncovered a void, an empty space beneath the ice. The drilling team wants to stop, but I need to know what's down there. There are noises. No one else can hear them, but I know they're real. August 20th, 1987. Something's wrong. We lost contact with the team below. I think we've awakened something. The others don't believe me. They want to leave, but I can't. Not until I understand. Not until I know what's beneath us. The last entry was scrawled, barely legible. August 23rd, 1987. It's here. It's in the ice. We never should have come here. We're not alone. I dropped the notebook, my heart racing. What had they uncovered? The next morning, I went back to the basement. The strange condensation on the walls had gotten worse, thick droplets running down the surface like the building was sweating. I could feel a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the outside cold. It felt wrong, like the air itself was tainted. I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a hatch in the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old equipment. It was small, rusted, and locked with a heavy latch. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I forced the latch open and pulled the hatch aside, revealing a narrow shaft leading down into darkness. A ladder was bolted to the side, disappearing into the void below. This must have been where they'd drilled, where they'd found the void mentioned in Clark's journal. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to walk away, but something pulled me toward it. That voice from the radio. Could someone really be trapped down there? I grabbed my flashlight and began to descend. The air grew colder as I climbed down, my breath coming out in frosty puffs. The walls were slick with ice, the metal rungs freezing to the touch. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom and stepped into a narrow tunnel, carved into the ice. It stretched ahead, disappearing into the darkness. I followed the tunnel, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The deeper I went, the more the temperature seemed to rise. The ice should have been solid, but I could feel warmth emanating from somewhere ahead. Then I saw it, a massive gaping chamber illuminated by faint blue light. In the center was something... a structure? No, it was organic. Massive tendrils of frozen flesh, twisted and coiled like roots of some ancient tree, encased in ice. And in the center of it all, a figure. A man, frozen solid, his eyes wide open, mouth twisted in a silent scream. It was Clark. The ice around him seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing. And then I heard it again. His voice, the same one from the radio, echoing in my mind. Help. Trapped. Cold. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the hatch, back up the ladder and out of that station. I radioed for a helicopter, packed my gear, and waited outside in the freezing wind, far away from the building. I don't know what they uncovered down there, but I know one thing. I'm never going back. There's something beneath that ice, something alive, and it's been waiting. The Man in the Walls. My name is Joel Harris, and I used to think nothing ever really scared me. After serving 2 tours overseas in the military, I figured I had seen it all, the worst that humanity had to offer. But what happened to me here in Cincinnati? That's something I wasn't prepared for. It started a few weeks ago when I moved into an old apartment building downtown, one of those early 1900s brick places with narrow hallways and creaky floors. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a cheap place to live while I got back on my feet. The landlord, Mr. Feldman, was an older guy, hunched over and gruff. He seemed nice enough, but when he handed me the keys, he muttered something under his breath that stuck with me. "Don't mind the noises. Old buildings make all kinds of sounds." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Every old place has its quirks, right? But it didn't take long for me to realize that something wasn't right in that building. The first night I noticed it, a faint scratching noise, like something was moving behind the walls. At first I thought it was mice or rats. The building was old after all, but the noise wasn't random like you'd expect from an animal. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone, or something, was scraping at the walls, trying to get out. I knocked on the wall next to my bed, thinking I'd scare off whatever was making the noise, but the sound stopped immediately. For a moment, the room was dead silent. I stared at the wall, my hand still raised, waiting. Then from the other side there was a knock, 2 slow, deliberate taps. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes, some weird quirk of the building, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was inside those walls. The knocking didn't happen again that night, but I barely slept. Every little creak and groan in the apartment felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. A few days passed and I tried to settle in. The strange noises continued, but I tried to ignore them. Then one morning, I found something that made it impossible to ignore any longer. I had just woken up and was heading to the bathroom when I noticed something strange on the floor near the baseboard. It was small, barely noticeable at first, just a bit of dust or plaster that had flaked off the wall. But when I crouched down to look closer, I saw it wasn't plaster. It was a fingernail, a human fingernail. My stomach turned. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, hoping it was just some weird coincidence, something that had been stuck in the carpet for years. But the nail was fresh, clean. Someone had just lost it. I threw it in the trash and tried to brush it off, but that night, the knocking returned. Louder this time, more insistent. I didn't respond. I lay there in bed, gripping the covers, listening as the knocking moved down the wall toward the door. Then for the first time I heard it, a voice, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. A whisper coming from inside the wall. "Help me." The next day I confronted Mr. Feldman. I told him about the noises, the fingernail, the voice. He just stared at me with tired, bloodshot eyes and shook his head. "There's nothing in the walls, Harris," he said. "You're letting this place get to you." I pressed him, asked him if anyone else had complained, if something had happened here before. His response was the same. The building was old. It made sounds. End of story. But the look in his eyes told me there was more. He knew something, and he wasn't telling me. That night, the noises were worse. I couldn't sleep. The knocking and scratching constant, like something was crawling through the walls. And the voice, that same whisper, growing louder. "Help me." I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and went to the bedroom wall, the source of the sound. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to know what was inside. I started tearing at the plaster, pulling chunks of the wall away, my heart racing with each swing. The wall crumbled easily, and soon I'd exposed a small section of the wooden framework beneath. But what I saw inside wasn't just old wood. There was a hole, small, barely big enough to notice at first. But as I shined my flashlight into the space between the walls, I saw it was much deeper than it should have been. A narrow crawl space, hidden behind the wall. And in the beam of my light, something moved. I jumped back, dropping the hammer. A hand, pale, thin, and filthy, reached out from the darkness, pressing against the wall from the other side. Then a face appeared, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and human. I scrambled backward, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure pushed itself forward, its limbs contorting unnaturally to squeeze through the narrow gap in the wall. The smell hit me next, like rotting meat and damp earth. "Help me," the voice said again, raspy and weak, but now unmistakably real. It wasn't just a voice in the walls. There was a man living inside the walls. I ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The next morning, I went to the police. I told them everything, the noises, the fingernail, the man in the wall. They looked at me like I was crazy, but when I took them back to the apartment, they couldn't ignore the hole I'd smashed through the wall. They sent a team to investigate, tearing down more of the wall, searching the crawl space. That's when they found him. He was dead, had been for at least a week, maybe longer. They said he'd been hiding in the walls for months, surviving off scraps of food he could steal from the apartments. The autopsy confirmed he'd been suffering from some kind of mental illness, probably schizophrenia. The police figured he'd been a squatter, moving between abandoned buildings for years. But that didn't explain everything. It didn't explain how he'd known I was there, how he'd whispered for help long after he should have been dead. They took the body away, sealed up the wall, and Mr. Feldman refused to answer any more questions. As far as he was concerned, the problem was solved. But I know the truth. That man wasn't just hiding in the walls, and he was waiting. The things in the walls. I've been an exterminator in Denver for almost 10 years now. I've seen a lot. Infestations of rats, roaches, bats, you name it. But what I found in that old apartment building on 7th Avenue, that's something I'll never forget. My name's Ryan McGregor, and I run a small pest control business. Just me and a van filled with traps, poison, and tools of the trade. Last week I got a call from a guy named Eddie, the superintendent of a rundown building in Capitol Hill. He sounded rattled, said they had a major infestation of some kind, but he wasn't sure what. "It's not just rats, man," Eddie said over the phone. "There's something weird going on. Tenants are complaining about noises, scratching in the walls, stuff moving around." I've dealt with weird calls before, but something about Eddie's voice caught my attention. He sounded more than just annoyed. He sounded scared. So I grabbed my gear and drove over. The building was a relic from the 1930s, one of those old brick buildings that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Paint peeling from the walls, flickering hallway lights, and that musty smell that only comes from decades of neglect. Eddie met me in the lobby, nervously wringing his hands. "Thanks for coming, man," he said. "Tenants have been calling me at all hours. They swear there's something in the walls, but I can't find anything." "No problem," I said, trying to keep things light. "I'll check it out. Probably just rats." Eddie shook his head. "I don't think it's rats." He led me up to the 3rd floor and down a narrow hallway. The place was eerily quiet, like the tenants were all holding their breath. We stopped outside apartment 308. "This is where it's worst," Eddie said, his voice low. "Tenants been complaining nonstop." I knocked on the door, but no one answered. Eddie unlocked it, and we stepped inside. The place was empty, but you could tell someone had been living there recently. Dishes in the sink, a half-packed suitcase on the bed, an open newspaper on the table. "They took off yesterday," Eddie explained. "Said they couldn't sleep with the noise anymore." I set down my gear and started checking the walls, tapping here and there, listening for hollow spots. Everything seemed normal at first, just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But then I heard it. A faint scratching, like something dragging its nails against the inside of the wall. I pressed my ear to the plaster. It was coming from inside the walls, but it didn't sound like rats. It was bigger, heavier. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "You hear that?" I asked Eddie. He nodded, his face pale. "That's the noise. It's been getting louder." I decided to start cutting into the wall. If there was something living in there, I'd find it. I grabbed my utility knife and made a small cut in the drywall. As soon as the blade pierced the surface, the scratching stopped. Eddie took a step back, his eyes wide. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just old wooden beams and insulation. But then I spotted it. Something shiny tucked behind one of the beams. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a small metal object, an old locket covered in dust and grime. "What's that doing in there?" Eddie asked, leaning in for a closer look. Before I could answer, the scratching started again, louder this time. It was coming from the ceiling. We both looked up, and that's when I saw it. A dark stain spreading across the ceiling tiles, something wet dripping down. "Jesus," Eddie muttered. "What the hell is that?" I grabbed my flashlight and shined it up at the stain. The beam cut through the darkness, and that's when I saw the outline of something moving behind the tiles. Slow, deliberate. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "There's something up there." Eddie took a step toward the door. "I'm calling the cops." "No, wait," I said. "Let me check the crawl space first. If something's living in there, I need to know what we're dealing with." Against my better judgment, I climbed up to the attic crawl space. It was dark and cramped, barely enough room to move. The smell hit me first, damp, rotting wood mixed with something else, something metallic. As I crawled deeper into the space, my flashlight flickered, and that's when I saw it. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges like something or someone had been clawing at the wood. I moved the light across the space and froze. There was a hole in the wall, just big enough for someone to crawl through. And around the edge of the hole, the wood was slick with something dark. Blood. I heard a sound behind me and I whipped around, shining the light into the darkness. Something moved. A shape, pale, hunched, and impossibly thin, crawled out of the shadows, its limbs twisted, its skin slick with grime. Its eyes glinted in the light, black and hollow, and it smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I scrambled backward, my heart racing, but the thing moved faster, slithering through the crawl space with unnatural speed. I tumbled down from the attic, crashing into the apartment below, my head spinning. Eddie rushed over, his face pale. "What happened? What did you see?" "Get out!" I gasped, pulling myself to my feet. "We need to get out. Now." We ran from the apartment, slamming the door behind us. I didn't stop until we were outside, standing in the cold night air, both of us gasping for breath. "What the hell was that thing?" Eddie whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I didn't know. I never went back to that building. Eddie called the police, and they sent a team to check the place out, but they didn't find anything. No creature, no evidence of what I saw in the crawl space. Just that old locket and the scratches in the walls. But I know what I saw. There's something living in that building. Something that's been there a long time, hiding in the walls, waiting. Well, if you've made it this far, congrats. You survived, for now. But who knows what's waiting for you when you turn off the lights tonight. If you enjoyed the stories, or at least didn't scream too loudly, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Join the dark domain, where we dive deeper into the shadows every time. And hey, why not give this video a like while you're still brave enough? And remember, if you hear a strange noise tonight, it's probably nothing. Probably.